Thank you. Such command. Good evening. I'm Mariah Thompson of the Library Company, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to the American Philosophical Society's Benjamin Franklin Hall for the 11th annual lecture in honor of John Van Horne. John served as head of the Library Company from January 1985 to May 2014 under two titles: the historic one of librarian from 1985 to 2004, and afterwards as the Edwin Wolfe Second Director in recognition of an endowment gift from Robert L. McNeill, Jr. Former Library Company President Hal Rosenberg wrote the following in his 2014 annual report, quote, "To honor John's magnificent legacy, our trustees, shareholders, and friends inaugurated the first Library Company lecture in honor of John Van Horne, an annual event that will bring some of the best and brightest writers to our doorstep. And you will find best and brightest true this evening when you hear from Richard Kagan. John has come out of retirement twice to serve the institution he loves. First, during a leadership transition in 2006, when Hal thanked him for his selfless service, and again in early 2024, when he returned to help the Library Company determine a reasonable, thoughtful, fiscally responsible plan for the future. It's been very challenging. And to use a sailing metaphor, he's been a steady hand on the tiller. Oh. Premature, you're going to have to do that again. While doing so, he has had the steadfast love and support of his wife, Chris, who is also a faithful supporter of the Library Company. Thank you, John and Chris. Before I welcome John Pollock, Curator of Research Services at Penn's Kislak Center, home of the Henry Charles Lee Library, I wish to offer a personal anecdote. When I was a graduate student at Penn, I spent considerable time on the 6th floor of the Van Pelt Library, often in the general reading room, but at other times in the Horace Howard Furness Library. This was a different experience. Books, for sure, but housed behind glass and wood cases, recalling their earlier domestic setting. Believe it or not, down the hall, there was another recreated library that in some ways made Furness Place second fiddle. This was and is the Henry Charles Lee Library. And based on a reading of Richard Kagan's book, The Inquisition's Inquisitor, Professor Kagan spent a lot more time in the Lee Library than I did in Furness. And curator John Pollock was with him every step of the way. John?
Thanks, Mariah. Good evening, everybody. That was fun. Yes, there have been many library hours have been logged. Good evening. It's really an honor for me to be here tonight. Thank you for inviting me to introduce our speaker. As Mariah was indicating, I think I am here because I can be said to wear a number of hats. I've become very well acquainted with Richard as he worked through the archives, not just at Penn, but really scouring the entire city in his quest to better understand Henry Charles Lee. We'll hear about this tonight. At the University of Pennsylvania, as Mariah just said, I helped to care for the Henry Charles Lee Library, which is one of our greatest treasures. I'm a student of the cultures of early America and of Philadelphia, as Richard has become. And I, like Richard and like all of us here tonight, am a deep admirer of the Library Company of Philadelphia, its collections, its mission, and its staff. In fact, I just spent a glorious afternoon up the road at the Library Company, where I had the pleasure of teaching a group of Penn undergraduates alongside Jim Green, the legendary Jim Green. our course is really a not-so-secret excuse for me to learn from Jim Green and alongside him, and to learn from and in the library company. And I've been truly privileged to have had the chance over the years to work with so many folks, Jim, John, and so many more. And I want to just take a minute to thank everyone publicly for the library company, its entire staff, thank them publicly for their dedication and hard work, even during what we know are very difficult times. So. And I want to echo Mariah's thanks of John. John, your dedication and passion for the work and the meaning of the library company are deeply inspiring to me and to all of us. So tonight we can celebrate the library company in multiple ways by learning more about one of its great patrons who perhaps we don't know too much about, and by celebrating an important scholarly achievement for Philadelphia and its institutions. So this achievement, you've seen it, I think, is the publication of Richard Kagan's new book, The Inquisition's Inquisitor, Henry Charles Lee of Philadelphia, which was published last year by the University of Pennsylvania Press. If you know little or nothing about Lee, you are forgiven. Richard will take us on a fascinating tour that will probably stretch from early modern Spain to 19th century Philadelphia, and definitely to the research spaces and reading rooms of our city today. Perhaps one way we might characterize Richard's impressive scholarly achievements is to think about him, Richard, as a kind of traveler or travel guide, leading us, who are his students and readers, into little studied and underappreciated parts of the European and American past. In his 1980 book, Lucrezia's Dreams, Richard brought us into the world of an extraordinary woman from a humble background whose powerful prophetic dreams brought her to the attention of the Spanish Inquisition, where she was tried at the end of the 16th century. And Richard has edited collections of Inquisition trials of secret or crypto Jews, and in several of his works, he takes us into the shadowy spaces of this hidden, hard-to-know group of conversos, so-called. Richard's book, Students and Society in Early Modern Spain, takes us into a different kind of world, that of the early modern university. In his study, Clio and the Crown, Richard examines what he calls the politics of history in an era when courts like that of Charles V and Philip II had royal historians who had to tread very carefully as they constructed their historical narratives. Now, perhaps we could ask Richard to reflect on the ways that our current history wars and debates over the American past have echoes in those times. Perhaps another night. Richard has also studied merchants and merchant culture, the rise of cities in early modern Europe, and even the exploits of Ferdinand Magellan, among many other topics. So Richard is officially retired from Johns Hopkins, where he's Academy Professor and Arthur O. Lovejoy Professor Emeritus of History. But I think, and in keeping with our theme tonight, there is no retiring of Richard either. And in Philadelphia, he appears busier than ever, to my eye at least. In fact, I think we can all take some pride into turning Richard into a Philadelphian, where he and his partner, Shreve Simpson, have now lived for a number of years, both contributing enormously to the intellectual life of this community. Shreve, if you don't know, is a preeminent specialist in Islamic art, and she teaches regularly at Penn and for Rare Book School. So with their move to Philadelphia, Richard, who, as I said, is a historian of early modern Spain, was making a turn to the more modern terrains of the 19th and even, dare I say, the 20th century. His 2019 book, which is called The Spanish Craze, America's Fascination with the Hispanic World, 1779-1939, traces Hispanophilia in the United States as it emerged in the 19th century. The surprising reach of an interest and even obsession with things Spanish. Richard's work in that book suggests some important lessons about the paradoxes of U.S. national culture that I think we're still grappling with in our own moment. And as we look toward 2026 and the many commemorations of the revolutions of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Richard's current project investigates the rarely discussed, I think, reverberations of those Central and South American revolutions upon Philadelphia. So with Richard, as you can tell, we're always traveling across terrains, cultures, into new and little-known archives to uncover new stories. I know we'll hear some tonight as we learn more about the life of the Philadelphian Henry Charles Lee. And I can't imagine a more passionate, wise, and entertaining guide than Richard Kagan. Thanks, and welcome, Richard.
Good evening, everyone. I think this is all set. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Can you all hear me? I'll put this out of the way because I'm wearing one of these wires. It's a pleasure and it's an honor for me to be with the Library Company and the American Philosophical Society this evening, and I welcome you all. Thank you very much for coming. Well, here in Philadelphia, the death of Henry Charles Lee on the October 24th, 1909, made headline news. It was also the subject of several editorials. And one published in the Inquirer read, and I quote, I shouldn't go back. A leader for many years in politics, in patriotic work, in economics, and sociology, as well as literature, he is best known these days for the books he wrote, not as a means of making money, but as contributions to scholarship and to history. Now, 3 days later, on the day of his funeral, it was reported that a line of carriages over 2 blocks long accompanied Lee's body from his home on the 1900 block of Walnut Street, and that house unfortunately was demolished in 1939, and you can see that lovely building that stands there today. It's a horror. The cortege went from his home, to a rather simple burial plot in Laurel Hill Cemetery. Other than family members, mourners included James Bryce, Britain's ambassador to the United States, who made a trip up from Washington to attend his friend's funeral. And a cluster of local notables were on hand as well. The famed physician and writer S.W. Mitchell, the noted Shakespearean scholar Howard H. Furness, and the distinguished lawyer and art collector John Graver Johnson, along with various officers of the city's leading educational institutions, virtually all of which had benefited at one time or another from Lee's largesse. One of those institutions, not surprisingly, was the Library Company, founded, as you well know, as a subscription library by Benjamin Franklin in 1731, and which in 1909 it occupied a handsome building designed by the famed architect, the brother of the Shakespearean scholar, Frank Furness. A longtime member of its board of directors, in 1887, Henry Charles Lee had gifted the Library Company $50,000. That's roughly about $1.7 million today, for the express purpose of constructing a new reading room as an addition to the Furness building. He did so, albeit on 2 conditions. One, that the library, previously a subscription library, be opened, and I quote, for the use of the public and be free to all. And secondly, that users of the library be able to borrow books. Construction on the reading room, which began almost immediately, was finished in less than a year. Lee was a real pusher. In which time Lee, an avid reader in his own right, also recommended the installation of a new invention called electric light. Opened soon to the public every afternoon, the new reading room proved immediate success. In the 1890s, users numbered 46,000. In 1890, users numbered 46,000. By 1993, that figure had jumped to 70,000. Unfortunately, both the Furnace Building and the Lee Annex fell to the wrecking ball in 1940, just a year after Lee's house. Despite this loss and the loss of his house, various vestiges of Lee's presence can still be seen in and around Philadelphia. One, perhaps someone knows it firsthand, is the elementary school in West Philadelphia that was named in his honor in 1914 as part of Mayor Rudolph Blankenberg's policy of naming Philadelphia schools after distinguished Philadelphians. And the portrait bust of Lee, nestled on top of a plinth whose inscription summarized Lee's achievements in various domains, is still there today. I can maybe get a close-up. No, I can't get a close-up. The inscription ends with the motto, and I quote, "He spared no effort. He wasted no time." An admonition that probably still terrorizes students as they enter the school every morning. And believe it or not, I've been trying to get into that school to take a modern picture of it. I can't get there. They won't answer my emails. Well, elsewhere in the city, if you look closely, there's other vestiges of Lee. They can too be seen. Go, for example, to there's the plinth and the mottos. Go to the First Unitarian Church on Chestnut Street, an institution that Lee attended throughout most of his adult life. In the main hall, you'll find this large stained glass window honoring both Lee and his wife, Anna Jaudon, which was commissioned by their daughter, Nina, in the year 1912. And have any of you ever seen that? Good, good. Or go a little bit further north, go to Laurel Hill Cemetery. Now, concerned that his son, enter now his son Arthur Jr., Arthur Lee, concerned that the simple granite slab, I showed it to you before, that Lee had ordered did not do justice to his father's achievements, Lee soon commissioned this well-known sculptor, Alexander Sterling Calder, good Philadelphia guy, to execute something a bit more impressive. And the result was this rather impressive gravesite, overlooking the Schuylkill in one of the most picturesque corners of Laurel Hill Cemetery, is this magnificent tomb. Its central feature is a statue of Clio, the muse of history. And I'll give a close-up. Well, one of its inscriptions, alluding to Lee's historical writings, reads, Veritatis delixet. He loved or he delighted in the truth. And have you seen that? It's really one of the most magnificent tombs in the cemetery. Now, if you want a bit more Lee, jump across the city to the campus of the University of Pennsylvania, where the facade of this building, basically an annex to the old Furnace Library, now called the Fisher Library, the university's original library, is located on 34th Street between Walnut and Spruce. It's still there. I'm certain many of you have seen it from the window of the 42 bus en route to Penn Hospital for one reason or another. It was financed by Lee's son Arthur and his sister Nina, completed in 1925, and it was meant to house their father's library, a collection of roughly 12,000 to 15,000 books that Lee had bequeathed to the university shortly before his death. It also housed the shelves, the original library, the new library, of the shelves and furnishing from their father's reconstructed study. And here's a picture of the original library, probably taken in the late 1880s or early 1890s. The study was then moved to the Henry Charles Reading Room and Library. Note the two staircases. They were in different ends of the original library. They put them side by side in the 1925 building. And then when it's now been reconstructed again on the top of Van Pelt Library, there's only one staircase. And I ask John Pollock all the time, where's the other staircase? And most of the artwork and sculpture and other furnishings that were in that original building, original library, are gone as well. And this library now serves as the centerpiece of the Kislak Center for Rare Books at Penn. Now here I should note that Lee's relationship with Penn dated back to 1871, when he briefly served as one of the university's trustees. He subsequently supported the university's museum's archaeological expeditions in the Middle East. And in 1890, he spearheaded the foundation, the establishment of a new institution, an Institute of Hygiene, which was the first public health institution in the country, but one that sadly languished, partly because it was quickly absorbed into the School of Medicine at a moment when other universities, one was Harvard, the other was Johns Hopkins, were then heavily investing in public health, whereas Penn did not. Big mistake. There's still no School of Public Health, really, at Penn. And in any event, in 1993, Lee provided Penn the funds necessary to establish that institute, and very important. And unfortunately, that building is no longer there. Now, I assume that most of you are aware of these monuments to Lee. Raise your hand. And how many have read any of his books? Raise your hand. He's a professor of Spanish history at Penn, he knows. Antonio Ferris. So let's have a quick recap of Lee's life. Henry Charles Lee was born here in Philadelphia in 1825. Second son of this man, Isaac Lee, a lapsed Quaker, and his wife, Frances Carey, Catholic, daughter of Matthew Carey, famed pamphleteer, founder of the family publishing firm, where Isaac, and I should say also a member of the library, the library company, I believe, Matthew Lee, together with his brother-in-law, Henry Charles Lee, a famed political economist, they all worked together in the family bookstore, then in the corner on Walnut and I think it's 4th Street, right? Now, Isaac and Frances had married in a Catholic church. But owing partly to a controversy here in Philadelphia known as the Hogan Schism, which is a very complicated affair, it's basically a tussle between Philadelphia's established tradition of what they called Republican Catholicism, a tradition which granted parishioners control over the management of the parish's affairs, even the appointment of their own priests. That Republican tradition on the one hand, and the more centralized, papal-centered, so-called ultramontane Catholic Church, personified in the figure of Philadelphia's new bishop, the Irish-born Henry Conwell. I don't want to go into the details of the Hogan Schism. It would take us all night. But as a result of it, Frances, Henry's mother, broke from the church. And that move was seemingly instrumental in what later became Henry's growing doubts about the Roman Catholic Church and his growing hostility to what he later called papal tyranny. Also, his opposition to what he called sacerdotalism, which was his term for what he believed was the unwarranted intervention of the Roman Catholic Church into the conduct of human or temporal affairs. But more about that later in this talk. Now, Henry was homeschooled. He never went to a school in his life. No primary school, no secondary school, no university. Homeschooled with the assistance of a rather gifted Irish-born tutor. He was quite intellectually precocious, well-versed in both Greek and Latin, well before the age of 10, or by the age of 10. And this page from his childhood notes tells us something about his interests in music. You see the clef. In nature, you can see there. There's the reference to the laurus tree, and food. He mistakenly calls his interest in lamb a lamb steak. There, with an AKE. He's just learning how to spell. This music, nature, and food. He grew up with all those. He never lost any of those interests, although later in life he becomes kind of a semi-vegan. As a teenager, his father Isaac, and his father was a specialist in conchology, a big fancy term for shells, especially freshwater mussels and other kinds of crustaceans. Mostly, he liked freshwater mussels. They're still they're being revived now in the Manayunk Canal. You can go see them. There's little scientists out there reviving the whole mussel culture of that body of water. Well, Isaac's he was interested in mussels and other mollusks. He engaged his very talented and somewhat precocious son as his research assistant. And it was in this capacity that Henry, at the age of 16, published his first scientific papers on shells, making some of the drawings himself. And there you can see them from the Academy of Sciences. Well, as my book explains, the methodology that Henry used in these papers, borrowed from his father's, had serious flaws. I don't want to get into the details. So many that he soon abandoned the field of natural science and mollusks, and in doing so, precipitated something of a rift with his father that figured in what may have been Henry's first breakdown, what he called despondency, in the year 1843, age 18. And that breakdown was probably also connected to Isaac's, that is to say, his father's efforts to break off his son's budding romance with his orphaned first cousin, Anna Jaudon, who was an orphan. Isaac was Anna's guardian, and he didn't like what was going on between these two cousins. They were 16 at the time. Isaac sent Anna off to Cincinnati to live with relatives, a separation that he was able to arrange as a guardian. Now, in the end, separating Henry and Anna backfired, as it served only to strengthen the relationship between the two cousins. And it also sparked a steady stream of surreptitiously drafted and delivered love letters, which I located in the Clements Library at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The original should be at Penn, but that's another matter. Well, these love letters, and they're a real rarity for the 1840s. Many of them written in this kind of cross-hatch script, making them almost impossible to read. They did it to save on paper. And so it's a real find for me. And they also provided me with a unique window into Lee's personal life. Among them, his burning youthful desire for lasting literary fame and recognition. I learned about his love of fine clothes, something he kept with him all of his life. In that first picture, he liked to dress up. And also, I learned about various personal details, including certain stretching exercises, like see this guy, that would enable him to become taller than he was. He tried to hang from doorstops and things like this. And Anna said, "Don't do that. If you get any taller, I won't be able to put my arms around your neck." These love letters are wonderful. She also didn't like his purchase what he called dumb-two bells, in an effort to become, as Anna once put it, Samsonic. She didn't want him to be more buff than he already was. Now, most of what I gleaned from those letters, and I really want somebody to study those letters for their language, for their context. It's a doctoral dissertation for somebody in English at University of Michigan or elsewhere. Most of what I learned from those letters go into my book's fourth chapter, my favorite in the book, as they revealed insights into the ideas, personalities, and aspirations of both Anna and Henry. And I should note that Isaac's, that is to say, his father's opposition to this relationship eventually ended, and the young couple eventually married in 1850. Children, 4 in all, arrived shortly thereafter. And here I perhaps should note that 2 years later, Matthew Charles Lee, Henry's older brother, married Anna's older sister, double cousins, And is Susan Lee here today with us? Susan here? Well, she's one of the descendants of Matthew Charles Lee. Thank you for coming. Now, by 1852, Henry was already something of a fixture in the family publishing firm. Dragooned into starting work there, and I say dragooned, he didn't want to do it. At the age of 18, it was not employment he especially relished, as his heart was then set on making a name for himself independently of that of a father and family, as a literary critic, specializing in poetry. Henry himself was quite an accomplished poet, musing himself by translating poems of various Greek poets into English that were published in various newspapers and journals. As a critic, however, and once again, poetry was his specialty, he was devastatingly harsh, a real bruiser, particularly on female poets like Elizabeth Barrett Browning. He disliked, partly because he had an absolute standard of what good poetry was like, and that was the lyric poetry of ancient Greece, that of Horace in particular. And any modern poet who didn't match up to Horace, by default, was mediocre or worse. Unfortunately, Browning did not make it, nor did not other people. Now, it was also about this time that Henry, working in publishing by day, writing criticism at night, pushed himself to the point that he suffered yet another. There's some of his criticisms. He pushed himself to the point that he suffered another breakdown, which is now then diagnosed as neurasthenia, and which effectively ended his career as a budding literary critic in 1847. Now, neurasthenia, it's not something that many people know much about today, but it's predicated on the idea that the human body is like a battery. And it's like filled with electricity. If you work too hard, like somebody like John Pollock or Patrick Spiro, you're going to wear that battery down. And it particularly affects kind of both kind of intellectuals, professionals, doctors and lawyers, they work too hard, and women. And the only cure for neurasthenia, the way to get the body filled up again with the necessary electrodes, is rest, a long rest cure. And in the case of Henry Charles Lee, this meant required him to abandon what was called intellectual pursuits for the space of 6 years. Now, for Lee, rest in this instance did not include work in the publishing business, and I don't know what that means, nor did it prevent him from acquiring books and the start of his personal library. And here I should emphasize, with respect to that library, he was not a bibliophile as traditionally understood. He acquired many rare books and manuscripts, but the library he acquired was fundamentally a working library, the repository of what he called the facts that he needed to write history. Now, in his day job, he's a publisher, and a surprisingly successful one at that. Following the retirement of his father in 1851, he cleverly engineered the firm's transition from a full-service firm that published everything from science to literature into a more specialized field, into the more specialized and highly lucrative field of medical publishing. And it didn't hurt that he secured the American rights to this book, Gray's Anatomy, a perennial bestseller. As a result, when in 1880, another bout of neurasthenia prompted his retirement from the publishing business, the firm, then called Henry C. Lee Publisher, was ranked as this nation's leading publisher of medical books. Now, the income earned from publishing meant for a rather comfortable life. Now, Lee was no Drexel, but by the time of the Civil War, and then here's the catalog of these books. By the time of the Civil War, Lee, a staunch unionist, and here I want to say, here's the family, the history, kind of the history of the publishing firm in miniature with all the iterations of its name, starting with Matthew Carrick and Company in 1785 to 1907, when Lee and Faberger was finally sold to a Baltimore firm. And excuse me, it disappeared and was sold to a Baltimore firm, I think in 1994. That date is correct. In any event, by the time of the Civil War, and I should say Lee was a staunch unionist. He served as a bounty commissioner, helping to recruit soldiers, black and white, to help Philadelphia meet its allotted quota. He also wrote lots of pamphlets meant to support the war effort under the auspices of the Union League, and he was one of its early members. Now, here I should also say that by time of the Civil War, Lee figured on what was called it figured on the list of the city's rich men. This was published annually, living together with his family in a rather comfortable home in West Philadelphia, and there it is. It was torn down some years ago, and rather, once again, a nondescript laboratory building stands in its place. And in the decades that followed, lucrative investments in coal mines near Pottsville, combined with others in commercial real estate in Philadelphia's central business district, moved him further up on the list of the city's rich men. And here is he owned buildings here on Market Street, on Arch, on Chestnut, Walnut, Sampson, and the like. And at the time of his death, estimates of his estate were roughly valued at around $4 million, or about $102 million in today's money. Not bad. And in 1880, as I noted before, he moved into that house, into that large mansion on the southwest corner of Walnut and 20th Street, spending his summers at another house in Cape May that no longer exists. Now, he also used his money to help finance his historical research and also to support his one major indulgence, the collecting of old master prints. And that Philadelphia, now cataloged under the name of his son Charles Lee, is housed in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, even though most of the prints in the collection were purchased by Henry. I should also say that in the course of his lifetime, Lee also purchased choice examples of Etruscan poetry and ceramics, several of which are now in the Penn Museum, and also some paintings. Whoops. Where'd I go? Wrong direction. Where's the, there, sorry, it's out of place. And some paintings, mainly by contemporary artists, such as this Bouguereau, which hung at the entrance to his library. Now, one of the key aspects, but often forgotten aspect of Lee's life was his involvement in politics. On the local level, now let me get to on the local level, he was an outspoken reformer bent on improving city services, cutting taxes, and preventing wasteful spending, something which helps to account for his dogged efforts to prevent the construction of this building, the new municipal building in Center Square. And instead of building that building, he proposed using the city funds to construct what he called a new cultural district, housing all of the city's principal institutions, the APS, the Library Company, the Academy of Sciences, PAFA, as well as a new public library that, in his view, would enable the city, and I quote, to become a metropolis, a true center of intelligence and progress. Otherwise, Lee warned, the city would remain little more than a provincial town. This battle is one Lee lost. Nor did he do much better with his campaign starting in the 1870s to promote honest elections in the city. Here, his enemy was the city's all-powerful ring, the equivalent of New York's Tammany Hall, run by a certain James McManus, head of the notorious Gas Trust, an organization which effectively controlled municipal elections in the city for much of Lee's life. And though Lee himself eschewed public office, he spearheaded the establishment of a series of political reform organizations, each aimed at the election of what he called the city's best men. That is to say, disinterested, high-minded, hopefully honest politicians. That proved ineffective. Remember, Lincoln Steffens, In 1902, Philadelphia was called corrupt and contented. Now, Lee was, I should add, was equally active on the national level. A lifelong Republican, he subscribed today to what Matthew Carey and his uncle, Henry Carey, called the American system, which is basically the 19th century equivalent of Trumponomics, in the sense that it called for a small federal government, low tariffs, low taxes, and high tariffs in order to protect and promote domestic industry. There's nothing new under the sun. Yet Lee's main concern was the reform of the spoils system. And so much so that he broke from a time for the mainstream Republican Party, and he joined what was known as the Independent Republicans, or mugwumps, and even support, in 1884, a Democrat for president, Grover Cleveland. But when Cleveland didn't do enough in the way of reform to get rid of the spoils system, or what was called civil service reform, Lee then turned on Cleveland. As a result, Lee acquired the reputation of being something of a political flip-flopper, with one critic suggesting, and I quote, "Henry C. Lee don't like nobody save for Henry C. Lee." Now, Lee's historical scholarship. Let's get to that. And that's really the topic that sparked my initial interest in learning more about Lee. Although interested in history as a youth, he only published his first book on the subject just after the close of the Civil War. And this was his Superstition and Force, a history of judicial proof that traced what he called the gradual disappearance of rude, ineffectual, and barbarous methods that were used to ascertain innocence or guilt. Think of ordeals of various kinds, holding a hot iron, for example. And he equated those rude, ineffectual, and barbarous methods with superstition. And he traced their gradual replacement by others, such as the jury system, that Lee judged more humane and more rational. And it was a very important book. Yet by the time it appeared, Lee's historical interest had shifted towards that of the Roman Catholic Church and his growing worries about sacerdotalism. To remind you, his term for the unwarranted intervention, what he saw was regarded was the unwarranted intervention of church authorities in temporal affairs. Well, these worries came to the fore in around 1864, following the publication of Pope Pius IX's encyclical known as the Syllabus of Errors, which anathematized all forms of scientific inquiry, together with progressive thinking of various sorts. Now, don't get me wrong. Lee was no real bigot. He's no bigot. He championed the freedom of every individual to worship as she or he saw fit. But sacerdotalism for Lee was something he really detested, something that he kind of mushroomed into a full-fledged ideological construct comparable to various other contemporary isms, all of which he judged reprehensible and a threat to progress. And the list is there. And so began what Lee called his insensible, odd word, insensible, as if it was unthinking, turned towards church history, announcing his intention in 1867 to write a book on the history of the Inquisition, both the medieval or papal Inquisition, which dated from the 13th century, and that of the Spanish and then Portuguese Inquisition, which began in the 15th century, at the end of the 15th century. And these two institutions whose history had long been a subject of heated polemic, with Catholics on the one hand defending them as necessary to battle heresy of various sorts, as well as Jews, and Protestants, and Jews who had converted to Catholicism but were backsliders and known as conversos. And he said defenders of these defenders denounced these heretics as, bigots or persecution and the like. No, I got that wrong. He denounced it, and then there were the supporters of the Inquisition, actually the opponents of the Inquisition, sorry, I got a little confused, who saw in opposite terms, the Inquisition was nothing but a monster, an instrument of bigotry, persecution, and hate. The Inquisition was written from these two points of view. You either hate it or you love it. And there are not too many people in between. In contrast, Lee set out to write what he considered a truthful account of its activities that he would be based upon a myriad of original facts that he culled from various archive and other original sources. Now, the work of assembling, assessing, and analyzing those facts, it began around 1870, was no easy task, as it occupied much of his attention and intellectual energy for the better part of 30 or so years. Now, most of these facts came from books that he had purchased from dealers in various parts of Europe. Other facts came from unpublished archival sources, and his two books on the Inquisition relied principally on this kind of original archival research. The problem was, he never left Philadelphia, except to go to Cape May, occasionally to the Delaware Water Gap in the fall to see the leaves. But he marshaled his business acumen and used his ample financial resources to construct the equivalent of an international, an elaborate international network of copyists. He called them agents, instructed to copy the archival sources that such a study would require. In the end, he applied almost about a dozen agents in cities as far-flung as Naples in Italy and Lima in the Americas, with several others stationed in between. And he also drew upon the services of United States diplomats in Europe and in Latin America, various scholars and friends, and in some instances persuaded the directors of various European archives and libraries to actually lend them the manuscript he wished to consult. And I have a wonderful story about the Bodleian in this regard, where you can't get any book or manuscript out of it. He managed to, but that's another, I don't want to go into that detail right now. Well, so successful was this undertaking, and so many were the facts piling up in that study, that in 1883, Lee decided to divide his monster Inquisition project into two. One focused exclusively on the medieval Inquisition, the other focused on that of Spain. Yet never one to sit on his hands, and then using the facts culled from his growing library, he also found the time and energy to write a series of other books, bypaths in his language, related to the history of the Roman Church. And these included important books on the history of clerical celibacy and the history of auricular confession, the latter being the most controversial of all his books, and one that he used to expand and express his thoughts about the dangers of sacerdotalism. You often call it clericalism as well, and its effects. Now, if sacerdotalism is the theme uniting all of these books, and here I should add perhaps that for all of what he called his scientific method, Lee rarely hesitated to moralize. He always wanted to remind his readers that sacerdotalism was a clear and present danger, that would undermine the continuing progress of humankind. As for the science, that is the objectivity of these studies, Lee's methodology in the end was less Baconian, that is to say, less inductive, and based on the objective analysis of facts that Lee himself often suggested. Rather, it was more deductive and predicated on a series of internalized principles, something that he was unable fully to recognize or ever admit. And thus, he had this idea, just as with lyric poetry, Horace is the absolute standards. If you don't measure up, you're no good. The same with his ideas about church history. He had preconceived notions. He would subsequently cherry-pick his evidence, select which facts best suited his intentions, and discarded those which did not. And in the case of the medieval Inquisition, for example, years before he started collecting any facts, that is to say about 10 or 15 years beforehand, he had no facts to write such a study. He had already decided what its outcome and conclusion would be. Novelists say this. You can't write a good novel unless you know the ending. Historians generally don't. At least before they shouldn't, at least. Now, these prejudices came to the fore in Lee's book on Spain's Inquisition. his modus operandi was this. He, realizing that Simancas and other Spanish archives housed far more manuscripts and documents relating to the Inquisition than he could ever digest, he instructed his agents in Spain only to copy certain documents that he decided that would enable him to get a sense of the size and the scope of the Inquisition's operations, together with its personnel and the number of trials and it held over time. And he was rather assiduous. He had all these notebooks documenting its operations. In the name of economy and efficiency, however, he didn't want to read individual cases of the Inquisition. They were too long and too costly and too much information. And I show this one. John mentioned it, Lucrecia de Leon. I wrote a book on it. That trial record is about 3,000 pages long. I can see why Lee didn't want to have it copied in toto. But there's a lot of information there, a lot of information. In any event, he concentrated on summary reports, and he then analyzed these materials in accordance with certain categories, as he did with the medieval Inquisition, that he had determined in advance. And for example, one of his notebooks, one finds the heading fanaticism. Fanaticism. Now, it's a category he derived from the Enlightenment, especially from Diderot's definition in the Encyclopédie of fanaticism, as I quote, blind and passionate zeal born of superstitious opinions, causing people to commit ridiculous, unjust, and cruel actions, not only without any shame or remorse, but even with a kind of joy or comfort, end of quote. Fanaticism. And for this reason, Lee had no difficulty listing under fanaticism any early modern Catholic practice or belief that, in his estimation, seemed a bit superstitious or irrational, and that fitted into that category. For example, the belief that certain holy women or certain images had the power to work miracles. Small wonder that Catholic readers of Spain's Inquisition accused Lee of prejudice, something he categorically denied. Now, I could go on. There's more to say about Lee's methodology, more to say about the reception of his many books. And here I should emphasize that his books on the Inquisition, whatever their shortcomings, constitute a veritable milestone. Better, they really constituted a turning point in inquisitorial studies. As virtually all previous books, as I pointed out earlier, whether the work of Protestants who detested the institution or Catholics who supported it, were long on polemic and short on facts. Lee's tried something a bit more objective. And on top of this, his pioneering books on the Holy Office served as a catalyst for what has been labeled the golden age of inquisitorial scholarship. An age that continues today with scholars going into the inquisitorial archives, whether in Rome, in Naples, in Madrid, or in Simancas, or in Lisbon, trying to unearth more about the individuals who were caught up in the Inquisition's nest, who they were, what they were believing in, and the like. And that kind of scholarship is what's going on, and it results in all manner of books. And there's new ones coming out all the time. I've just learned today of a new one on magic in 16th century Mexico with Spanish women learning about magical practices from indigenous women. And then they were had up by the Inquisition for practicing all kinds of strange rites and the like. And to close, here we must recognize that Lee was appointed the president of the American Historical Association in 1902, which is the leading then as now the leading professional historians, association of historians in this country. He grappled with an issue that still confronts all historians today. Namely, by what standards do we judge past actors? Do we judge them, if we're studying somebody from the 18th century, by the standards of the 18th century? That is, of their era? Or do we judge them by the standards of our own day? And in this address, he took a direct aim at a prevalent notion that there are fixed moral standards in the world that ought to be applied to the past. But Lee didn't like that idea. He said he observed that historians who aspired to become judges, and I quote, should not try a case by a code that was unknown to the defendant. In other words, don't judge the actions of the Inquisition in the 15th century, or Philip II in the 16th century, or Queen Elizabeth in the 16th century by the standards of the 20th or the 21st century. That's excellent advice. Yet advice that Lee, ever the moralist, often ignored. And he also believed that historians have an obligation to highlight past evils so they would never be repeated. Now, finding that right balance, that balance between objectivity on the one hand, moralizing on the other, is a challenge that historians of every era confront. It's a challenge that confronted every historian. There's several sitting in this room. And for this reason, Lee, whatever his shortcomings as a scholar, he deserves our admiration for his dogged and repeated attempts to get that balance right. Thank you very much. And one more slide to close, for all of the people who are past retirement age here. This is my favorite quote from Lee. If life and vigor being unexpectedly prolonged, I will make the best use of them that I can. For I have always found my enjoyment in work and prefer to wear out rather than to rust out. Do we have time for some?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
So
thank
now
you.
it's time for the audience
Yes,
to,
get me.
yeah. So have at it. We got some questions? Thank you so much. Yeah. Complex man.
John.
John, right in the front row.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Richard. That was absolutely fascinating. I was intrigued in the book about how Mr. Lee was able to prevail upon librarians in Europe to
Yes.
send him huge batches of original manuscripts. As a steward of such materials, I was really scandalized by that. And I wonder if you could comment on how common the practice was or how he managed to accomplish that.
Well, the cases, I gave this a variant of this lecture in a place called Oxford, and there's a large library in Oxford called the Bodleian, and then some of you have worked there. Now, when you go to work in the Bodleian, you have to sign, you swear on your life that you won't bring any incendiary materials in, and also that you won't take anything out, and that's been there for hundreds of years. Lee, in the 1870s, persuades the director of the Bodleian Library to send several packages of 17th century Spanish manuscripts to Philadelphia, which he then copies what he wants, sends it back, and they send another one, send another one. How was that possible? He did it with two other archives, but the Bodleian one is the one that stands out. Well, one, he paves the way by sending him a copy of Superstition and Force to the director of the library. It's a nice gift. I'm a serious man. But he's also, he has friends in London, and he said he's a gentleman. And that's the magic term. They trusted him. And he sent the books, they sent him the manuscripts, he sent them back. But at one point, there was a mix-up. Mm-hmm. And the head of the library thought he had lost, that the manuscripts didn't come back. He didn't know where they were. And that became, that news about that got to the Prime Minister, Disraeli, someone mentioned Lee's interest in borrowing manuscripts, and Disraeli supposedly said, yes, but they never come back. Well, that story got to Lee. He was furious. He then made copies of the receipts he had from the library, sent them back to England. The library admitted he made a mistake, and Lee's name was cleared, but they had to publish public apologies. But it was the fact that he was perceived to be a serious, gentlemanly sort. And it was those connections. It's never happened since. When I told the people, the professors in Oxford about this, they made me repeat this at the end. Well, tell us how this happened. It doesn't happen. It's never happened since. It's a unique occasion. He got them from 2 other European archives for the same reason, because he was a gentleman. Intervention of diplomats, and that it helped. Who would subscribe to it. But it doesn't happen to this day, today. You can't do it. You can't do it. But it's unique, and I don't know if anybody else, no, excuse me, the local types often borrow manuscripts and never, they're friends of the librarian. But no one, Lee, it's a unique case in the history of the Bodleian, and for my sort, to my knowledge, for an American scholar to be able to borrow original materials from European collections.
I have the mic.
My treasure, my Bodleian library card is green.
Yes, Jessica Roney.
Thank you so much for this talk, Richard. This was amazing. I just wondered, sort of piggybacking on John, he was asking about the materials going there. I was wondering how the European scholars responded to his analyses, his fire hose of scholarship. I mean, how did others, especially European scholars, Spanish scholars, how did they think of his work?
Well, he was regarded as the most important American historian of his generation, more so than Henry Adams. Henry Adams wrote about U.S. history. He wrote about, he really talked about European history. He's the only really major American scholar doing so. He had most of his books were translated into French or German or Italian in his lifetime. Some of them were used in ways that he didn't like. They were used by his books on Inquisition were used by anti-clerical reformers in France. They published little snippets of it and published in little fascicles and distributed for political purposes. He didn't like that at all. Actually read on the floor of the French Parliament. He didn't like that. But he's a well-regarded figure, except in Catholic circles. And there he has plenty of enemies. Plenty of enemies, both in Europe as well as in the United States. And some people, and you can read the obituaries, and they're crumbling bits of paper in John's archive. They're all falling apart. They should be digitized. You go through them. Most of the people who kind of Protestant papers or Protestant scholars, oh, well, he's the best ever happened. The Catholics saying, the bigot is dead. So, he is, but even his harshest critics respected his scholarships, because although he was he had it out for the Catholic Church, they respected the fact that he was using original sources and making an effort to write an objective history, and that is a non-polemical history. He was cherry-picking his evidence, but it wasn't totally distorted. It wasn't the kind of that earlier stuff that I showed you on the screen. So, he was elected the president of the American Historical Association in 1902. And in 1980s, when the American Historical Association did a poll of the council members of that organization to make up a list of the 10 greatest American historians who ever lived, who are no longer alive, Henry Charles Lee is one of them, along with people like William Hickling Prescott, famed historian of Spain, Henry Adams, Frederick Jackson Turner, Bancroft, and the like. So he's up there. You don't get much better than that.
Yeah, Richard, Lee was also a member of the American Philosophical Society, and I didn't know if you wanted to share how he may have been involved with the society itself and the role it may have played in his life.
Well, his grandfather was a member of everyone who was the whole family was in the American Philosophical Society, starting with Matthew Carey and Henry Charles Carey and Isaac Lee and Henry Lee. And what's the name of the organization? Yeah, there was Caspar Wistar in the late 18th, early 19th century, a leading member of this institution, had created kind of a little APS inside the APS. He had monthly dinners for selected friends. Isaac Lee was the head of the Wistar Association for many, many years and hosted his dinners in his particular in his house. His house, by the way, Lee's house on 16th Street, on Locust between 16th and 17th is for sale. It's a double townhouse. A lovely townhouse if you have a lot of spare change. Somebody needs to buy it. It's been a law house. He hosted Wistar parties there, and then Henry took it over in the 1880s and 1880s after his father's death. So he was a lifelong member of the APS. Towards the end, he didn't. Because of his eating habits, he became this kind of. He followed what was called a neutrogenous diet that was heavy on legumes, low on meat. This is to keep his battery full. He kind of backed off on these parties. But one thing I didn't do, because I was told at the time that the Wistar party records don't exist. You told me a few weeks ago that they do, and I'm going to come back and look at that material. So he was committed to this institution, and portraits of his father are here, and there's another portrait of Lee. And do you have one of the busts as well, the Graf Lee bust? There's one in the library company has one, like the one in West Philadelphia.
Thank you, Richard, so much for that talk. Your discussion of batteries running low, depression, especially for those of the female persuasion, and his disrespect for female poetry, although it seems like it actually extended to poetry, regardless of gender, makes me want to ask the question, he's coming at a time when more and more women are becoming involved in academic scholarship and writing, not, over a huge majority, but some. Is there any discussion about, for example, when he insisted that the Library Company of Philadelphia be open to the public, did he mean the
He
public?
meant women.
Yes, okay,
He was very proud of the fact that women were coming in.
great.
His wife Anna was a great. You read those love letters from the 1840s. She was a great reader, and she was saying, "Why are you reading this? And why are you reading that?" They went back and forth. She's in Cincinnati. He's here. He had enormous respect for her, and she was quite independent in her own right. But soon they got married. Soon as they got married, she became a good Victorian wife. She kind of disappears from the public sphere and becomes a mother and gets involved in helping nursing organizations. She hosts tea parties with her daughter, who never married.
4 children will do that.
Yeah, and so but he was interested in. He thought education was a good thing for men and women alike. Education was the only way. He wanted an educated electorate. He said you can't have honest elections if you have an uninformed electorate. Not a bad idea. And that's one of his perennial interests in promoting education, promoting better elections. And it was a lifelong quest. He died unhappy in that respect. John, uh-oh.
It's wonderful, Richard. Thank you so much. No. I mean, it's a sort of a corollary to some of the conversations we've just been having. You alluded to this, but I wonder if you could say a little more about the context of Lee growing up, living, and then being a scholar in Philadelphia in its increasingly and often violently anti-Catholic context. You talked about how this is problematic for the church, but this is a violent world for Catholics, and increasingly so. And how do you see him, though? How do you see him in that space? Thanks.
It's not in this talk. In the 1840s, this was the hotbed of anti-Catholicism, or anti-Romanism. The famous riots here in 1844. Several churches were burned in Northern Liberties and then in the city. And then they were attacking St. Patrick's Church on 20th Street. Lee was living, I think, on 10th, near where the library company is right now. He supposedly got a gun a rifle and went out and stayed up all night to defend that church against the Protestant mobs. He didn't like that kind of violence. He thought he said, every church has the right to exist. Everybody has the right to worship as they please. So the notion that the idea that there were rampaging mobs of basically anti-immigrant, anti-Irish nativists running around, he found that to be anathema. The irony, so in that respect, he said, you have to respect religion as it is. Freedom of conscience, that was sacred to him. So he would never say, he said, I'm not he would say, I'm not anti-Catholic as a theology, as a faith. I don't like sacerdotalism or clericalism. The irony about the St. Patrick Church, the back of his study was closer to St. Patrick's. And St. Patrick's in the late 1880s put up a new steeple and started ringing bells. He hated it. 7 o'clock in the morning? He used to stay up to 1 o'clock and stuff. He said, no, this is disturbing my sleep. And then his father, he joins a lawsuit, this is very interesting, against St. Mark's on Locust Street. New steeple. They started ringing bells also in the 1880s. His father was irate. This bells? And then they got guys like Sir S. Weir Mitchell to come out, the doctor, who was Lee's personal friend, his physician. He said, this can cause neurasthenia. It can kill you. And they had a lawsuit that went up to the State Supreme Court of Pennsylvania and said, no bells. It's going to kill us. And they won that lawsuit. So they could have bells at 9 o'clock, but not at 7 o'clock in the morning. And it's a major fight. So that's the Episcopal Church, though. So he was anybody who intervened on his space, and he's a practicing Unitarian. The second half of his life, he wanted quiet, what he considered to be rational religion. He didn't want too many. He didn't like priesthoods. He didn't like too many priests. He didn't like elaborate liturgies and the like. He thought religion's a quiet, private affair to contemplate. So any bell, any clergy, better to spend your money with the APS or the library company, or go to the social arts club occasionally, which is now the Rittenhouse Club, and talk to your friends, than spend a lot of time with those priests. It's dinner time. Neutrogena's diet.
Neutrogena's diet. Well, we have to keep those batteries.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.